Well, to discuss the issue, we're now joined by Jerry DeMarco, Canada's Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development. Mr. DeMarco, good to see you face-to-face for the first time.
Good to see you, Michael.
Listen, I want to begin our discussion here with a comment that you made during the press conference. And you basically said that in all the time that Canada has committed to reducing greenhouse gases, we are the only G7 country to register increases rather than decreases. Can you give me some context to that? Just what number are we talking about when it comes to Canada's increases, and compare that to numbers being posted by other G7 countries?
Right. So since Canada committed to first stabilizing and then decreasing greenhouse gas emissions in the early 90s, our emissions are up 14%, even though we've been trying to put them down. Compare that to even the United States are down slightly, and then several European countries like Germany or the UK, they're down in the 30s, even the 40%. So we went on the up escalator of emissions while all the others went on the down escalator of emissions.
Now, what does that mean then? Because, Canada, like all countries, they do modeling before they introduce programs. Is that modeling insufficient? Are the programs not specific enough?
So there's been a litany of problems over 30 years. It's hard to summarize all of them in a short answer, but I would say modeling is a big problem, and that's come up not only in today's reports, but also last year's reports on hydrogen and so on. The measures themselves have not been sufficient. So some measures, they overestimate the benefits that they will be getting from them, and then when it comes to the deadline of the target year, say 2020, that recently passed, they implemented the measures, but the measures didn't accomplish what they actually set out to do. So there are lots of different problems, but the bottom line is they've had several targets over the years, and they've never met one.
Mm-hmm. And part of it, too, is, if I may, because in your report you note the fact that when you go to Environment and Climate Change Canada and you ask, for example, how each program has done or contributed to reducing greenhouse gases, they can't really talk to each program because they take more of a macro look. So how problematic is that? Yeah,
so what we're asking them to do in our recommendations is to parse out to the degree possible how each measure is contributing to the whole, because all of their last plans have added up on paper, yet when you get to the deadline year of the target, they're nowhere close to the target. So something's amiss. We're making these recommendations so they can course correct during the implementation rather than just finding out at the end of the implementation what went wrong. This would help them, if they implement the recommendations we've been making, help them actually achieve a target for the first time, and that would be the 2030 target. That's the next one.
Mm-hmm. Now, as we talk about emission targets, you also note in the reports today the tree planting program that was committed to by the Liberal government in the last campaign, 2 billion trees by 2030. You say the program is now behind. So what impact does that have on the government's goal of reaching net zero by 2050 and reducing emissions as well by that year?
Yeah, so the projections for that program in terms of carbon storage were overestimates. So they're not going to really store any carbon in those 2 billion trees. Even if they do succeed in planting them all by 2031, they're not going to have the storage benefits until 2040, 2050, 2060, and so on, because it just takes so long for trees to grow, right? And they're really only sequestering large amounts of carbons when they're medium to large size trees. So they overestimated the contribution of that program to net emissions reductions. It's still worth doing the program. There's lots of benefits long-term in carbon sequestration. They're just not going to get the immediate return on investment by 2030. They'll get a little bit of return on investment by 2050, not as much as they were projecting, and then they'll get even more in the decades to follow, as long as the trees stay alive. That's another issue in our report, which is they do need to monitor them to make sure that it's not just a tree planting, but it's a retention of trees as well. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. And then you also point to another problem, challenge, and this has to do with species protection, because I'm going to read the number here, because you note the fact that of over 500 species identified as being at risk for nearly 30 years, they are still at risk today or worse off. Mm-hmm. So, when you talk about things like greenhouse gas targets, when you talk about the tree planting program, when you talk about species protection, do you get discouraged at where we are, or is there still hope? Because it seems like there are all these government promises and programs, but based on what you said today, they all fall short, or we can't actually report an accurate number.
Yeah, so it is discouraging from one perspective. From another perspective, though, the attention to these issues, the public support for protecting nature, for protecting biodiversity, for addressing climate change is greater than ever. So that's what gives me some hope. The younger generation gives me a lot of hope. The amount of ecological literacy, or environmental literacy as we call it, is much greater now than when I was a kid, for example. So there is some hope, but the difficulty is governments often are focused on short-term deliverables, and many of the environmental and sustainable development issues that we're facing have multi-generational impacts and returns on the investments. So if you invest now in protecting or in reducing emissions, it may not have a political payback immediately. So that's the difficulty. Governments are not great at addressing long-term problems.
Mm-hmm. Is it fair to say you think, in broad strokes, the government's in the right direction and it's a matter of fine-tuning, or is it greater than that?
So the commitments are in the right direction. So you asked me if I'd be discouraged. I'd be even more discouraged if they didn't even want to protect nature or want to address climate change. So we've got the commitments. It's discouraging the lack of progress. But at the end of one of our reports, we do talk about signs of hope in terms of climate change. Now that there are stronger regulations in place, a Net Zero Accountability Act, which was not in place before, carbon pricing, and so on. These are things that should start to pay off. It's not a case of just a plan that is on a wing and a prayer. There are actual measures that should pay off. Whether they're enough to meet 40% reductions by 2030, we'll have to see. But I doubt we're going to see emissions ever as high as they were in 2005 again, for example.
Jerry DeMarco, really appreciate the time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.